The next topic this afternoon, I think, is one that is close to the heart of the vast majority of managing directors of agencies around the world at the moment, and it's about what to do with millennials, those born in the 80s and 90s. And our next speaker, Kevin Reid, he's executive chairman and partner at Pottinger. And I know that many of us who have built our careers in more structured and more formal times may find the attitude of the millennials harder to understand, shall we put it politely? So Kevin's going to share some insights on how to do that. So if you just join me in welcoming Kevin to the stage. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, look, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to Milan. It's certainly a beautiful city and certainly has the most beautiful railway station in the world that I've ever seen. The genesis of this particular talk followed a conversation I had with Francis over the summer when I was explaining that in a typical year at Pottinger in London, we have between 50 and 60 paid internships. And I was perhaps rather foolishly suggesting I thought I knew a thing or two about how they thought and what some of their expectations were. Luckily for us, those internships come from all over the world, probably 20% through American schemes, 10-15% from Asia, but a great many from Europe through the kind of Erasmus, Da Vinci type schemes. But those sort of initial high hopes turned into a much deeper and more careful consideration of the wider topic of millennials. And in some senses, I was knocked off track about 5 weeks ago when some of you may have noticed, but I actually broke my wrist playing tennis. And today is the first time ever that I've actually presented on drugs. On this occasion, it says straightforward painkillers. But what I'm going to do is share with you personal insights that have come from talking to lots of different interns and many junior people across the ranks of consultancies. And the first exercise I did for this particular talk was to talk to a whole range of MDs, partners, directors, people I know in the industry, because I wanted to capture, in essence, what the sort of baby boomer top end or the older end of Gen X was actually thinking about millennials. And so I asked them to tell me, and I'll show you in a minute what they said. Some of it wasn't very polite, and when I showed it to some of my junior colleagues, they said, well, they're all negatives. And that actually then led me on a much more reflective journey to understand why that might be. And what I'm going to talk about is very much that journey in terms of how I think baby boomers and Gen X have got a lot to do to actually understand millennials before actually developing strategies which might work effectively in the consultancy environment. So that's the agenda. Just a quick reminder, millennials, as we define them, probably anyone born between about 1980 and about 2000. So this is the group of people between about 35 and 15. And those of you very good at maths will know that means about 2/3 of the millennial generation are now in work. There's a few still to come, and we're not quite sure how they're going to pan out, but the impact and effect of the bulk of millennials is now being understood. But what do the baby boomers say when you ask them, can you tell me what you think, what you most remember from having worked with millennials? And I think the answers are quite interesting. I hope you recognise some of these. Firstly, that they're highly demanding. They're very much me. I want it now. They're less loyal than Gen X or baby boomers. They feel they're somehow entitled to things, almost without very much microphone. Can you give me a lapel microphone, please? Is there one? That they're lazy. I thought this one was particularly harsh. I'm not sure in my experience millennials are lazy, but I think sometimes is because they're not so cooperative. They can come across in that way. They struggle with hierarchy. They hate authority. They detest being told what to do. There's this ongoing feeling that they can't think for themselves. Again, I'm not sure that's quite true, but sometimes it's how they come across as a consequence of their behaviour. And this last point, they always want to be spoon-fed. They need to understand all 21 steps in preparing a media release. So this was the snapshot I got, albeit not scientific, but I think it captures the essence of what most of us have experienced in one form or another with the millennial community. The thing that troubled me, I showed this to one of my 22-year-old colleagues, and she was horrified, and she said to me, "Kevin, they're all negative. Millennials are not coming across here very well." And she self-defined something, which I kind of wanted to touch on today, is that millennials, the brand, in some senses, have a problem because their behaviours and attitudes are certainly not being understood by the baby boomers who are trying to work out the way to get the most out of them in the workplace. So when I was lying in bed for a day or so with my arm bust, I had more time to read some of the research. And there was a lot of recent research coming out of America on this particular subject. And I was also trying to reflect that if I took the millennials as a brand project, what kind of change would I like to see in the perceptions that were clearly out there? As I started to map where I'd like to take an accepted perception in terms of a future desired perception for the millennials. And I'll just run through them quickly. And this is an exercise that was very powerful because it started me on a journey to start to understand the millennials in a very different way and coming through their lens rather than as a baby boomer thinking, well, give me a bit of time, give me a bit of nudging, give them the right rewards, I can get them to behave in the way I want. And I realised as I did this exercise, that was never going to happen. Highly demanding. Well, you can see that a totally different way. They are actually very passionate and they want to play their part. And unlike previous generations, they want to play their part from the day they arrive. From the first hour they're there, they feel they can do something and want to do something. The me, yeah, that can still be there, but you can look at this in a different way. They're just ambitious people. They're probably the most ambitious generation than there's ever been in the workplace. Are they less loyal? I think in some ways it's too early to tell how loyal they truly are. But what they are is that they're more demanding. They won't just trust anybody who talks to them. If they've got an account director and they don't like them, they don't think they're very good, boy, they don't hold back. And so I think sometimes the issue of loyalty is more about them wanting to make their own decisions around trust. Do they feel they're entitled? Yeah, I think they do, but I caveat this in one very specific way. I think they're prepared to give, but they always want to know what they're getting out of giving their time or their effort, and that's often misunderstood. Instant gratification. It's a generation that is used to, from about the age of 2 or 3, to being constantly praised by parents, by teachers, everyone in their world. And in some senses, it's not the millennials' fault that their behaviours are the way they are in terms of gratification. It's a consequence of the culture in which they've been brought up in. Struggling with hierarchy. Now, to a certain extent, every generation has its rite of passage. Every generation has its way of rebelling against what's gone before. And I don't think millennials are really any different, other than in one aspect, is that they do not like not having access to the person who really knows, who is the font of wisdom. They hate dealing with people 2 or 3 levels who are not necessary to get to what they want. And that has huge implications for the way in which we organise consultancies and do work. Can they think for themselves? If I'm honest, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that Pottinger has when people come into our environment where we would like people to do projects really early and take on responsibility. And there is some coaching that we have to do there to get them to think in slightly different ways. But what I've learned by this particular trait is what the millennials really react against is some of those junior jobs that we all probably did. The research notes, the press cuttings, the reports, those repetitive, boring jobs which are often asked of people and not particularly well explained. And if you do those for more than 6 or 12 months, I think anybody might actually start behaving in a different way. The spoon feeding, again, I think is a function of education to a certain extent. The way in which education has moved away from being much more around problem solving into learning in lots of small packets with regular gradings and regular steering through. If you've been through an education system, certainly in the US or the UK, where you've had 13 years of close guidance for every single exam you've ever had to do, you can't unlearn that the day you arrive in the workplace. But what is important here is the point about they want to understand why. They hate doing anything if they don't know how it fits or where it takes them. So that was my attempt to try and put myself into the heads of the millennials and to try and filter what I thought was useful in terms of a structure which senior people in a consultancy actually needed to think about quite a lot in terms of actually getting the best out of these people. So what that meant was I sat down with quite a few of my senior team and colleagues and started talking to them about a few things and different ways in which they could start to see that millennial generation. You can't have a generation that is the most teched up generation in the world, and the day they arrive in work, they don't have the technology or the perceived technology they need to do their jobs. Too often, maybe as a baby boomer, we think, oh, they're just about digital. But they're just as much as any generation need the on and offline interaction, and sometimes we forget that. Equality and diversity is very, very important to them. And very often I think a lot of consultancies have been looking at this and are working on this, but don't always articulate it as powerfully as they could. We could, in consultancy, sometimes make a lot of our processes and ways of doing things much more simple, much more efficient and convenient. Lots of organisations just do not review how they do things regularly enough. And I know there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of software and thinking being used or starting to be used in PR, which I think would help with this enormously. Managers, senior managers have to recognise the millennials are a confident generation. They are not going to become unconfident, and that ability to embrace is incredibly important. Hierarchies is a difficult one because every consultancy is arranged in a different way. But the longer the gap between the entry level and the most senior person in the building, the more trouble you're going to have with millennials, especially if you don't afford the millennials the access to the very senior people as regularly as possible. Like all generations, they are fun seekers. I find nothing unusual in that. But these millennials, they are pragmatic. And in my experience, and having read the research, the sense of community is very important to them. So when you're thinking about your consultancies, the essence of your culture is vitally important to them, far more important than you think in terms of it's all about promotion, it's all about moving quickly. They also have to feel they belong, and it's a culture they're happy and comfortable with, and equally there's an opportunity for them to truly engage with their peers as well as other people at more senior levels. They definitely want to know who they're working for is making a contribution beyond the servicing of their clients, and I'll come back to that point later. They know that if they rise up the ranks quickly and take on authority, they know every further step they take, however young they are, they're going to have to take the responsibility that goes with that. And I think sometimes senior colleagues don't help them on that particular journey, but they want to make their own choices. Again and again, I say to my colleagues, give people some space to make their own decisions, even at the junior levels. But in terms of their immediate desires, what can a consultancy do to help start or kickstart the change in culture? Teamwork is absolutely vital. Find the time to explain. It is really, really worth it. Try and give people the access to leaders who they can genuinely and quickly trust. The millennial generation, I've heard so many times people talking about how millennials want a mentor. But people forget that millennials also want to be the person mentoring as well, as quickly as possible. And that's a very swift and efficient way of carrying them forward. They want to create and they want to contribute. So old-fashioned structures of learning and training, which are all based around telling in structured environments, do not work well with them. You can use experts, that's fine, but you have to move in much more co-creation environments. Ultimately, though, they want to be inspired. And in most consultancies, that inspiration needs to run from the very top of the organisation. If there are two things which I think they feel most annoyed about, one is they don't feel listened to. You can make of that what you will. And they sometimes feel they just don't have the opportunity to influence. They have an idea. They don't know what to do with it. They're not included in decisions and influences on their careers. That is something else you need to look at very carefully. So that took me to a space where I realised I'd probably been totally misunderstanding the millennials. I've been getting it wrong. And I had to be brave enough to say I was getting it wrong, and I had to be brave enough to say, do you know what we have to do? We have to change the way we look at these people, how they are, what they want, and what we can do for them. And then it dawned on me something that was totally missing in that analysis, and that was me. What did I have to change? Not just what did I have to understand and what could we do, but what was it in my behaviours, the culture of Bell Pottinger? What was it that we would have to start doing differently if we wanted these people to be more effective with us? And there are a number of things. Some of these were painful conversations, some of these were difficult self-reflections, but nevertheless I'll share them with you. First and foremost, I had to stop projecting my expectations onto the millennials. What does that mean? It means that when I went to school, the idea of being praised every day didn't exist. When I was at school, to do exams, you had to study, you went away, you worked it out, and you answered the exam questions once a year. In my day, you were expected to do jobs for 2-3 years. In my day, you had to earn everything in a well-planned and well-structured way. It just dawned on me, this is all nonsense. I can't use this worldview with the millennials. And at the same time, I thought back at various points in my own career about hierarchies. I'm not very good with hierarchies either, so this one comes a little bit easier. But it's simple things about making sure you give access to the people in your organisation who really knows their stuff, to the people who needs to know, and avoid any blockages at all. Those are sort of two biggies. Then there were some others that were a little bit more subtle that dawned on me. I don't think that most consultancies fully understand the extent to which the millennials want to know the contribution your consultancy make goes far beyond having great client service. They want to know there's a wider societal, cultural, economic, positive contribution emerging from the communications that we do. That is missing, and we as an industry actually need to address that. I come from the old school. So growth, margin, profit, it's been drilled into me year after year. I've been sent half a dozen budgets to look at while I've been here. But I have to accept that growth, profit is not always going to turn those millennials on, certainly in the formative years of those careers. I have to find other things that's going to match what they want to achieve. I also realise, and we all make these mistakes sometimes, that when we appoint people to senior positions, we just expect everyone will follow, because that's old world thinking. If the millennials don't like it, they don't think they're very good, they're not going in the right direction, they will vocalise it, either formally or informally. And it's dangerous to ignore that. You have to listen to what's actually coming back. and just broader strategies that we've been trying to look at all around inclusion, all around integration, recognising that we need cultures that are much, much more nurturing than have ever been before. We need to celebrate much more the achievements of our younger people in our businesses, put them on pedestals that might normally take 10, 15 years to get to. It works, it's low cost, and creates great cultures. We don't often pay enough attention to intergenerational or diversity issues. One of the things that frustrates me in the area where I'm working at the moment, when we're doing work on creativity, is that people say things like, well, let's round up the usual suspects for the brainstorm. I cannot think of anything worse. It's a great line from Casablanca, but it should stay in Casablanca and have no role in the industry world. But perhaps the biggest and most challenging thing for consultancies is to know when to promote and when to reward these millennials. And for senior people in consultancies, there's this amazing tension. Because on the one level, you want stability, you want controlled cash flow, you want to have structures that have, to a certain extent, encourage equality and diversity. At the same time, the millennials want to move quicker than perhaps any generation before. So there's a line to balance between how financially led you are and how people-led you are. In my experience, it's only small tweaks that can often be necessary, and small rewards meet the needs of millennials. And if you're going to have your battles with your finance director, that is one of the battles I think that is actually worth having. What has that meant in practical terms? And I'm the first to admit a lot of this work is work in practice for us. We are looking more and more to find better ways to empower people, giving the chance to people to work younger and on more senior opportunities. We're looking at trying to dismantle hierarchies when we can. That's not easy, though. I'll be first to admit that. One of the things I've been doing with my senior teams is to encourage them to use a lot more unconditional giving. Things do not have to be absolutely perfect before you say, well done. Things do not have to be totally exceptional before you can actually praise. And this point about how do we get commitment from millennials, we include them. So looking for inclusion strategies are absolutely vital. More recently, we've been doing some work around creativity. We've coached probably a dozen now of our execs to be facilitators of brainstorms and are looking for ways of bringing people in at the bottom into roles which might otherwise or historically be seen as much more senior than they actually are. We have no choice, and this is one of the moans I get from partners and associates about explaining why. I do not think the millennial generation will let go of this particular point. They will not do things unless they know why they're doing them, what the context is, where it leads, and equally importantly, what's actually in it for them at the end of the day. Diversity comes from having policies. Diversity comes from having an intent to change structures. But you can also encourage diversity by immersing people in different ways in your particular organisations. And practically, we've done a huge audit on our tech, and we are now giving our starters probably the best tech of anyone in the agency. And it's just recognising what we have to do. And in turn, the trade-off, we'll give them great tech, but then you reverse mentor up the chain as the trade in that particular direction. So that's how we kind of approached my kind of epiphany moment and practically thinking about these things. But some things are more institutional. Some issues, if you like, the baby boomer generation failed to tackle. And these are things that are not easy for one consultancy or a group of consultancies to tackle. These are much, much bigger issues. Baby boomers are actually quite hierarchical. They're used to hierarchy, they're used to moving up the hierarchy. Many of them, once they obtain power, pull the ladders up after them. There are other issues, such as some of the disciplines we've historically recruited from, such as journalism. Anyone who's ever worked in print journalism knows it's probably one of the most selfish dog-eat-dog environments you ever have. And some of those values have come into and are well embedded in the senior levels of PR consultancies. The point about financial first. Anyone who's been in a senior job thinks to get up the ladder, you've got to have a P&L, you've got to run a P&L, you've got to show you can do 45% gross margin. And you're drilled into this. But this comes from a generation of accountants that came into the industry, probably late 80s, 90s onwards. And some of them are less interested in the millennials and are still interested in the hard financial performance. As I mentioned before, we have a weak definition, I think, of how PR contributes in a wider way to society, whether that's about economic growth, whether that's about social change, whether that's a cultural driver. The millennials want to see and understand that, and they want to see us as an industry articulating that. One of my personal big bugbears, PR people are generally rubbish at managing because there is no general management, nearly everyone. Mostly rubbish, but general management is not part and parcel, isn't considered important enough. And what happens is our people rise quickly, they get up to partner, they get up to director level, and all of a sudden they have to manage a pack. They've never been taught about networking. They've never been taught about the finance. They've never done any HR coaching or whatever in their lives. But this is an institutional problem, I think, within PR. Linked to that is I think the industry has made some progress, but it hasn't always defined carefully enough what knowledge you need to have to be a great PR, what the professional skills are, and it hasn't accredited. And that's still space to work on there. Sometimes the balance of power between the consultancies and in-house can also get in the way of us evolving great millennials, because the in-house people will poach them. And there's all sorts of tension that sometimes doesn't always work in our favour as consultants to give them the best run at things. I won't go on about the digital revolution, digital social revolution, but that is another huge area for us to work through, not just in terms of how we integrate digital and social with our, what I would call classic skills, but it's almost as if we have to redefine what we're doing, and some of that's been talked about today. We have to decide what we are. Are we about reputation? Are we about advice? Are we about really working at the highest level in business? Are we the true storytellers? Are we the true integrators? These questions are being grappled with at the moment, and those full answers aren't there. So those are some of the bigger issues that sit outside or aren't fully in my ability, or most people on their own in this room's ability to change. I just want to conclude with two sets of final observations. I'm going to share with you some of the things that we've been thinking about, looking at, some implemented, some not, some still up for debate within the Pottinger environment. And I put the millennials into sort of four categories. There's the graduates, the first jobbers, what I call the rising stars, and the people who've almost made it. And they fit, if you think through the, so anyone between 21 and 35 would typically fall into one of these. Our graduates have to have leading edge technology. We try and give them the most senior mentor we dare from the day they actually arrive. We want them to understand the fundamentals of our business. They will sit in on our pitch process as soon as possible. We do not hold them back. As soon as somebody comes in through the doors in Holborn Gate, they will be expected to be working on new business. We've understood in terms of skills assessment is sometimes the millennials bristle a bit if they're over-measured and they're told they've got to get all these skills. So we're trying to move much more to a self-assessment basis where they start to define where they think their skills are in their own terms. The trade-off for some of these initiatives are all about them paying back, so entering into a psychological contract with us, such as coaching us on the technology of things. And this point about just occasionally sitting in a board meeting, sitting in on something very senior, accelerates their learning and locks them in terms of actually belonging. First jobbers are quite a difficult bunch to sort of read. In my experience, you battle to keep hold of them for more than 2 years. And things you can do in those first 6 to 9 months have a huge impact on whether you'll get 2, 3, 4 or more years out of them. Financial rewards become important, I think, especially in those first 6 months. Peer-to-peer coaching, absolutely vital from us. Becoming reverse mentors, absolutely chilled about that from our point. But the other thing, and most of you will know this if you've ever done any change management or if you've done any HR, your first jobbers are most valuable to you in terms of understanding your culture and identifying where the blockages are in the first 3 months. So we're experimenting with the idea that after the first 3 months with us, they have to write a change report. They have to formalise what it is that they've seen and make recommendations to us. Just 2 slides to go. The rising stars, these are people who we expect to get to senior levels. We have to map their journey out as quickly as possible. We want them to have end-to-end ownership as quickly as possible. We want them to have general management skills. We will help them, once they're on that track, to develop their networks. There's no point on leaving this until they're an associate or higher in the consultancy. It's just not worth it. We need to get them into a kind of director in charge role on an account as quickly as possible. Yes, we like them to have specialist knowledge, but specialist knowledge isn't everything. Sometimes the horizontal skills are as equally valuable, such as planning. Where we can, international exchanges are really good. Anyone who's ever tried to do that knows what the problem with that is. You send somebody to Hong Kong or Singapore for 6 months and they want to stay for 2-3 years and they never come back. So what we try and do is we swap one person with one person, and we then do actually have financial penalties if they don't come back. So there's kind of goodwill and lock-in simultaneously there. With new seniors, it's all about letting them know exactly what your expectations of them are, what the financial expectations, what the client expectations, what broader responsibilities they'll have in terms of the consultancy. They are going to be mentoring from day one. They will be the people who increasingly we turn to for our graduate coaching. And they need to know, almost before they reach that senior level, that we will expect them to manage portfolios. So those are some of the practical things that we've been looking at doing. But I couldn't come here today without at least touching on the title of this conference, which was very much about food for thought. So I'm going to end with 6 predictions or suggestions for where the industry might go. And I really don't want to be held to any of them. I think language is becoming really important, and I think the word communications is probably going to supplant the word, or it's 2 words, PR, over the next 2 to 3 years. It's the interconnect strategies that are really important. We've heard about this today. It's getting the insights. It's balancing that with the creativity and the engagement that's driving the industry forward at the moment. I believe consultancies need to do some thought leadership on what their wider contribution to society, economically, culturally, actually is. For me, it's the reputation advisors who truly understand business and the great storytellers in the future will command the highest salaries. I think media relations is waning. I can't tell you how quickly it's going to wane, but as we've heard today also, we need to step up in the areas of paid and owned, and in that I'd throw sponsorship. But above all, what I'd like to see most, probably in the next decade, 5 years would be great, but what PR and communications need is its own version of an INSEAD or a side business school where we can take the raw great talent we have and make them much greater commentators and observers and understanders of business as well as everything in communications we do. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Kevin for a very thoughtful presentation. I think I haven't seen a clear analysis of what we can practically do before around millennials. You know, we need to understand their drivers, let them into the boardroom occasionally, let them create and contribute. I don't think they're any different from any other generation. In fact, they want to be part of something. Clearly, old school's not going to cut it. And overall, you probably need to explain a bit more, which is, you know, all good, sound advice. So thank you very much indeed.